Welcome to Bourbon and BS, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of spirits one shot at a time. I'm Mike Fody, founder and director of the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company, where my goal is to help you master spirits so that it guides your choices for your next bottle. In this episode, I'm going to explore how yeast impacts aroma and flavor of bourbon and whiskey. I'm going to discuss the Man Cave Distillery and answer some questions I've received since the beginning of the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company that I've received through some of my deluxe tours at the Buffalo Distilling Company, as well as questions that have hit the blog on my website. The primary initial flavor profile of distilled bourbon comes from the four main sources: water, grains, the distillery's yeast and fermentation process, and distillation. Fermentation significantly influences the final aroma and taste of the selected grains, which we discussed in the previous podcast. Yeast converts the simple fermentable sugars produced during cooking into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. The yeast's activity produces various types of alcohol and other congeners, which are aromatic compounds, which we will cover in this podcast. We'll also review some of the other ingredients necessary for yeast to ferment the sugar and to be active. Distilleries like Four Roses use different yeast strains for one simple reason. Yeast is a flavor engine, not just a fermentation tool. Changing the yeast changes the whiskey, and sometimes very dramatically. And here's a clean explanation of what happens during fermentation. So as I stated, yeast creates aroma and flavor, not just alcohol. Most people think that yeast's only job is to convert the sugar into alcohol. That's the primary job, but it produces a lot of other things as well. Esters, which are fruity notes, phenols, which can be spicy, floral, or herbal notes, acids, and higher alcohols. These compounds shape the whiskey's entire personality. Different yeast strains give you different yeast flavor compounds. So what you have to understand is, especially on a column still, what will end up happening is whatever's present after the end of fermentation is what's concentrated by the still, and that ends ultimately up in the final new spirit, new make spirit, or white dog that's being produced by distillation. So I'm going to use Four Roses as an example because they use 5 different yeast strains. As far as I know, they do not provide specific data on the yeast strains that they're using because it's all proprietary information. But each is designed to produce a specific flavor family. For instance, a floral family, something that's spicy, a fruity family, a herbal family, and then sort of a rich delicate. By pairing these different yeasts with specific mash bills, and they only use 2, they can create 10 distinct bourbon recipes, all from the same distillery. It's like having 10 colors on your palette to paint with instead of just one. Using multiple strains allows a distillery to maintain consistent flavor in its core products, but also to create unique profiles for single barrels. And then also it helps with the blending process as well as building complexity in small batches. What ultimately yeast gives them is a flexibility without changing the grain or the barrel. It also influences how whiskey ages. Some yeast strains produce compounds that develop into fruity notes over time. Some soften with age. Some amplify the oak sweetness or the oakiness. And some hold up better in long-term maturation. So by choosing the right combination of yeast, barrels, etc., you can get a different profile. And that's what people are looking for in a lot of places these days, are different profiles, different whiskeys, instead of the same old thing. So yeast is a signature sometimes of the house style. In Scottish distilleries, they rely a lot on the shape of the still or the peat level that they're using. The casks are typically already used once, either for bourbon or sherry. But American distilleries often rely on yeast to define their identity, which is what Four Roses does. I'm going to talk about yeast and how it's used in different countries. Yeast is, again, the engine of fermentation, of converting sugars into alcohol and producing flavors. While all regions rely primarily on one species or one strain, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, their approaches diverge based on tradition, regulation, and innovation. And some are using different strains of yeast of Saccharomyces. In the United States, where the typical whiskeys are bourbon, rye, and Tennessee whiskey, the yeast type could be proprietary distillers yeast strains, and that's often, as I said, kept secret. Some use beer type or baking type strains for their flavor diversity. The fermentation goals are higher alcohol yield, robust performance under heat and stress, and flavor complexity because they tend to produce esters, phenols, and alcohols. The flavor impact, yeast is considered a major flavor driver in bourbon because what you get out of that fermentation process is what's going to be concentrated and go through the maturation process and end up with the final product. Distillers like Four Roses use multiple yeast strains, as I mentioned. Wild Turkey and Heaven Hill emphasize yeast's role in their brand identity. And the trends are to start moving towards experimental yeasts, wine yeasts, and wild yeasts, which are just found in nature. The emphasis on yeast is for it to be a creative tool for flavor innovation. If we cross the pond and go over to Scotland, the yeast type is brewer's yeast or ale strains. It's an industrial distiller's yeast, which is very rapid in its process. It's very neutral and it produces a high yield. Rare exceptions used mixed or wild strains, for instance, Glenmorangie Alta. The goal, of course, with all of these is efficient alcohol production, a clean wash with minimal yeast-derived flavor, as well as letting the cask and time shape the spirit of whiskey. And that's something that's very true about both Scotch and Irish whiskey because they're using used barrels, and so they're not looking for that oakiness. They're not looking for the barrel to produce specific flavors. The majority of flavors that come out in Scotch and Irish whiskeys, or any whiskey that's aged in a matured barrel, comes from the interactions of the chemicals within the whiskey when it's put into the barrel, as well as the oxidation that occurs as a result of the angel's share. The trends in Scotland are a slow shift towards flavor-driven fermentation. Sustainability and stress tolerance in yeast selection is also desirable. So they want they're resistant to the changes that are occurring in the United States, and so that they're sticking with the standard historical strains that they've used in the past. Irish whiskey, similar to the Scottish whiskey, uses brewer's yeast and industrial distiller's yeast. They have started using some wine yeasts or mixed strains of yeast to try to add some complexity. The biggest difference with Irish whiskey, of course, is most of it is triple distilled. So the yeast flavor is not as highly emphasized, but just understand that instead of a single distillation or a double distillation, you're getting a triple distillation. So that concentration profile can play a bigger role. The impact from a flavor perspective is for yeast is much more subtle, and the focus is more on the grain, the distillation, and the maturation. Craft distillers in Ireland are experimenting with yeast for flavor nuance, and greater interest in fermentation as a flavor stage or flavor provider is occurring now in Ireland. Next is Japanese whiskey. And of course, Japanese whiskey is actually influenced by Scotland in part, but also by sake brewing. And so some distillers use sake yeast strains. Most distillers' yeast is used, but there is a focus on developing new aromas and new flavors. The goals are, again, a balanced alcohol yield with aromatic complexity. The Japanese tend to be more precise in what comes out of their fermentation process, and they like to incorporate the yeast so that it contributes to a floral and fruity profile. Japanese whiskey often emphasizes sort of elegance and balance over a boldness, which you might find in American whiskey. Again, their trends in Japan are to use sake yeast, and the integration of Japanese fermentation philosophy, the old philosophy of using brewers or distillers yeast, is being combined with sake yeast into whiskey making. So the fermentation process, we're going to step through that a little bit. It begins by adding distiller's yeast to the wort, which is a sugary liquid obtained from the mashing or the cooking stage. This triggers the fermentation process when the yeast is pitched. They call it pitching. And that starts the metabolism of the sugars into alcohol, carbon dioxide, as well as congeners, and a lot of heat is produced. And it's actually always enjoyable, or I find it enjoyable, to go into the room where fermentation is occurring, because you can smell the alcohol, you can smell the yeast, you can smell the wort. From an aromatic perspective, it's like an aroma heaven. So this conversion of sugar to alcohol is ultimately what gives whiskey it's not only its alcoholic content, but its aromatic profile. The process consists in two phases, the lag phase and the budding phase. During the lag phase, the yeast adapts to its new environment, which you've just pitched it into, and it slowly starts multiplying. This phase is relatively slow, but it sets a stage for more active budding phase. And budding is the reproductive process that yeast goes through. In the budding phase, the yeast cells reproduce rapidly, consuming the available sugars and converting them into alcohol and congeners. And what you want to do is have that yeast convert every single molecule of sugar into alcohol, because that's the yield. You want as high of a yield as possible. So to maximize yeast growth for whiskey production, you have to consider the following elemental or environmental conditions. The first is temperature. You really need to maintain a temperature range of 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 15 to 21 degrees centigrade, during fermentation or malting, to encourage steady growth and enzyme activity without unwanted bacteria or fungus. The nutrients, and again, the way they help maintain the temperature control in any processing container in whiskey production, is they have jackets on the tanks. And these jackets, they can run water through the jacket at various temperatures in order to regulate the temperature. And you really have to monitor that very closely, because if the temperature gets too hot, it can kill the yeast. If it gets too cold, the yeast starts slowing down and you won't get the production that you're looking for. The next element is the nutrients. You have to provide essential nutrients such as amino acids, minerals, and vitamins to support yeast metabolism and budding during the fermentation process. Time. The duration of the fermentation process impacts conger development and complexity. Some distilleries will distill for up to 110 to 120 hours, and other ones it's 1 to 2 days. So that difference results in the production of different aromatic compounds, and also it impacts the amount of alcohol. pH and wort concentration. The optimal wort pH, which provides buffering capacity, is somewhere between 5.2 to 5.6, and that helps with the growth of the yeast and the development of flavors. So if it's too high, if the pH is too high, the starch converting enzymes won't work effectively, leading to incomplete sugar conversion. If it's too low, it's too acidic, and then you end up resulting in incomplete conversion as well. So that buffering capacity is very, very important, and the temperature plays a role in that too. But keep in mind that decreased mash pH or acidity can weaken the pH drop during fermentation. The wort concentration, wort with a higher gravity, which means more malt, it tends to have higher free amino nitrogen, which they call fan levels, which are essential for yeast growth. But just remember there's a balance between nitrogen and sugar. If there's too much nitrogen, it means there's less sugar, which means less production. So yeasts are remarkable single-cell fungus that give flavor to the whiskey, the final product. They're basically like a little factory. Again, the species is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and that dominates aromatic production for all types of fermented beverages. So one thing that comes up quite frequently is people talk about sour mash versus sweet mash, and why does that exist? Well, originally sour mash was accidentally found. And what that does is you use a portion of the previously fermented mash known as backset to start the fermentation of a new batch. Why do some of the distilleries do that? It helps maintain a consistent flavor profile across batches, and also it provides an acidic environment created by the backset that inhibits the growth of unwanted bacteria. So if bacteria literally infect the batch, it can destroy the flavor profile. And that's one thing that they accidentally found out, was they were originally throwing in the backset into the fermentation tanks to try to increase the output or the amount of alcohol that could be produced. When they did that, they realized that fewer batches were being ruined by bacterial contamination. So as just a way of saving batches, they started throwing a backset into every single fermentation tank. And it's not a little bit, it's quite a bit. It depends on the distillery how much they use. But it typically results in a richer, more complex flavor profile. And the distilleries that have been using it for, a century or two, they don't want to change the process that they're using, because again, when you walk into Maker's Mark or Woodford Reserve or one of the big boys, their ability to produce a consistent profile is critical to their sales. Whereas for the newer craft distilleries, that isn't as big of a deal for them. Now, what's the difference between that and sweet mash? Well, with the onset of the ability to produce better cleaning products, they found out that they could get rid of most of these bacteria that were causing the problem. So, if you use fresh ingredients for each batch without incorporating any previously fermented mash, that's called a sweet mash. And what happens is that offers more control over the fermentation process, allowing for unique and distinct flavor profiles, generally associated with a cleaner, lighter flavor. The challenge is it requires meticulous sanitation and monitoring to prevent contamination. Both methods have their own merits, and to be honest with you, the choice is typically based on what they've done historically, because people don't want to change for fear that they're going to change their product, and then the consumer will notice it, and it will have an effect on sales. So ultimately, what yeasts provide is higher alcohols, esters, which are responsible for fruity and sweet aromas, aldehydes, which can add nutty or apple or green apple-like scents, terpenes, which are associated with herbal and citrusy fragrances, and then phenolic acids, which convert into esters and other flavorful aromatic compounds. Again, all of these compounds are going to be concentrated in the distillation process. Some will not make it all the way through, some will, but I'll talk about distillation in future episodes. During fermentations, yeast produce acetic acid, acetaldehyde, organic acids, ethyl acetate, volatile fatty acids, acetone, glycerol acids, esters, and carbonyl compounds, all of which are important for the secondary aroma of beverages. And the amount of these compounds, again, are based on the distillation process and the yeast and how much of those things it produces. So you can get things like acetic acid, which is vinegar, acetaldehyde, which is fruity green apple scent, some organic acids can add to the overall complexity and mouthfeel. Ethyl acetate imparts a sweet, fruity aroma. Volatile fatty acids can range from buttery to rancid. Acetone is associated with a creamy, buttery character. Glycerol affects the mouthfeel. It makes it smoother and maybe even slightly sweet. Esters are responsible for the fruity, floral, or spicy notes, and carbonyl compounds, which include aldehydes and ketones, they contribute to a diverse group of flavors. So like the mash bill, yeast strains are highly guarded secrets in most places in the United States. Sometimes they're openly advertised by the producer to tell their product story and increase demand, and somewhere in between with other places. So Four Roses leads the somewhere in between yeast discussion. The Kentucky-based distillery has a library of over 300 strains, but it uses 5 of these along with 2 mash bills to create 10 base recipes for its bourbons. But they don't tell anybody, it's proprietary. And then you have the folks like Wilderness Trail Distillery. They share their mash bill, it's right on their label, and the yeast strains if you ask for them. So the next part of this podcast is really the Q&A. So I'm going to try to answer some questions as succinctly as I can that have cropped up through various channels. And one of it is what appearance assessment tells us about whiskey. What does looking at it? So things like the color. They give you clues about the age, the cask type, and the intensity. The cask type, like an ex-bourbon, will give you a lighter gold, straw, honey color. If it's a sherry or a port wine, it gives you amber, copper, and mahogany. So think about your typical ex-bourbon. There's not a lot of compounds left in the wood because they've been leached out by making bourbon. And so what's left is fewer compounds to cause the development of color. And if you've ever seen White Dog or New Make Spirit come off of a still, it's clear, it's colorless. So you're really looking for that color to come from the cask that the whiskey is maturing in. It also gives you an idea of age and the amount of extraction that's going on. So if it's a longer time in oak, it's typically a deeper color. It also will tell you about the cask activity. First fill barrels impart more color than refill barrels. So color is not a perfect indicator of quality, but it is a reliable indicator of the amount of oak influence, or if it was previously a port cask or a sherry cask, it can have more of a reddish, brownish hue to it. The next factor around appearance is the clarity. And there's a couple of issues around clarity. One is filtration and one is potential faults. A whiskey should be clear, not cloudy, unless it's non-chilled filtered and diluted with water. So what can clarity tell you? It can tell you whether it's chill filtered. If you have a glass of whiskey, you throw an ice cube in it, and all of a sudden it starts getting cloudy, that's called that cloudiness occurs as a result of lipids that become precipitating, that form a cloudiness in your whiskey because of the cooling. And it also can tell you whether there are faults. So if you look at a glass of whiskey that's not chilled and you see a haze or a sediment or a cloudiness at room temperature, it can indicate poor filtration. So just to sum this up, premium whiskeys aim for a bright, clean clarity. There shouldn't be any cloudiness at all. If you ever see whiskey that's when it's dumped from the cask, because of the charring of the inside of the barrel, you'll find little pieces, very minute pieces of carbon and other things that are in the whiskey. So that's why they do filter it, but that's a lot different than chill filtration. So what about viscosity, or sort of like a texture or thickness? Some people call it legs or tears. When you swirl the glass, and you should never shake or roughly agitate a glass of whiskey, you should only swirl it. The way the whiskey runs down the side tells you a lot about the alcohol content. So the higher the ABV, the slower or thicker the legs are. It also gives you mouthfeel expectations, More glycerol and fatty acids give you a richer, oilier texture. It's not a quality test, it's just a texture preview. And then next I'll talk a little bit about surface behavior. What does that mean? The volatility and the aroma intensity off of the top of the surface of the whiskey. Now it's pretty interesting because when you talk about volatility, that's how quickly the aromas lift off of the surface, and that's an indicator of ethanol intensity as well as oil content. If there's higher oil content, then you'll get a lower amount of intensity. If there's a higher ethanol content, you'll get a higher intensity. So there's always a playoff between the two. The other thing to think about with the intensity is the way to judge it. The way you judge intensity is if you can put your nose 6 inches or approximately 5 to 6 inches away from the top of the glass and smell it, that's a high intensity. If you're like at 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches away from the top, that would be a medium intensity. And if you basically have to shove your nose into the glass in order to smell it, that would be a very low intensity. Now, what you always want to do is start from a high level and move towards the glass itself with your nose in order to test the amount of intensity or the level of intensity. So occasionally, whiskey forms a tight, oily pool on the surface, which often has a heavier, richer profile. Again, so all of these factors they play off of each other. There's a balance between them. The next thing I'll mention real quickly, and I did sort of with sediment or particles, some of them are natural versus filtered, but you can see barrel char flecks sometimes, you can see natural oils, and you can see unfiltered sediment. They aren't flaws, they're signs of minimal processing, but unexpected sediment can indicate storage or bottling issues. So in short, appearance is the whiskey's first story. It gives you a feeling about the product that you're going to be tasting. It gives you an idea of where it's been, the cask type, the age, the warehouse conditions, how it was treated. Was it filtered, diluted? What were the bottling choices? And then what to expect with regards to texture, alcohol intensity, and aromatic lift. Appearance doesn't tell you whether whiskey's going to be good, but it absolutely tells you what kind of whiskey you're about to experience. So why is it recommended only to swirl whiskey, which I mentioned, and not to be too aggressive? So what ends up happening from a sensory perspective and science perspective, that is that if you shake it really hard, that actually causes the alcohol to evaporate more quickly than it normally would, as well as the other congeners. And those chemicals evaporate based on their volatility or their ability to evaporate at whatever the current temperature is in the room. So a whiskey that's high proof, if you whip it around in the glass like you would a wine, you'll blast your nose with a wall of ethanol the minute you put your nose towards the glass. And that can also overwhelm your olfactory receptors and temporarily numb your ability to smell the nuances of the product. So the idea is to gently swirl it, and that will provide a controlled aroma release. Aggressive swirling will cause an ethanol grenade or bomb to hit your nose. Whiskey doesn't need oxygen the way wine does, so that's another reason why you don't need to aggressively shake it. Wine does benefit from heavy aeration, but it's delicate and low in ABV. Whiskey's already oxidized during the years in the barrel and doesn't open up the same way that wine does. So a light swirl is enough to lift the aromatics without stripping them. Over-aeration can also flatten the delicate notes. Too much agitation can blow off volatile, fruity, and floral esters, those congeners that are extremely volatile. They evaporate at very low temperatures very easily. It pushes forward harsher oak and ethanol notes, and it makes the whiskey seem sharper than it really is. You lose a lot of the top notes if you over-aggressively swirl or shake a glass of whiskey. What does gentle swirling help you assess? It helps you assess the viscosity, You can look at the legs or the tears, the oiliness, get some texture clues, as well as the ethanol concentration. The higher the ethanol, the greater the legs or the wider the legs and tears. And so finally, it keeps your the sensory experience intentional if you just swirl it instead of aggressively shake it. Whiskey tasting is about controlling the aroma intensity, pacing, and palate fatigue. A gentle swirl gives you a clean aromatic lift, predictable nose, and a better sense of the structure of the whiskey. Aggressively swirling gives you the noise instead of the information. So in short, swirl whiskey like you respect it. Just enough to wake it up, not enough to punch your nose in the face. Aroma, how does the olfactory system influence our whiskey experience? So I always get these questions about these experts say they smell this and they smell that and they smell all kinds of things. And I had the same questions. I mean, these people would say they smelled fresh cut grass on a Sunday morning or whatever it is. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. But the reality of it is everybody's sensory system is different, and our ability to sense different aromas and taste different things are completely different. And they're based on all kinds of factors that I'll go into. So your tongue, though, from a taste perspective, in this experience process, it can only detect 5 things: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Everything else, vanilla, caramel, smoke, fruit, spice, chocolate, that all comes from your olfactory system, not your taste buds. This is why whiskey becomes dramatically more complex when you nose it first. So aroma molecules travel in 2 ways. Whiskey engages the olfactory system through what's called orthonasal smell. It's what you smell when you bring your nose to the glass. As I mentioned, you bring it up close to the glass, your nose close to the glass, very slowly. Start at about 6-7 inches and then move in until you can smell. The next thing is retronasal smell. It's what you smell after you swallow, when aroma molecules travel back up your throat and up into your nasal cavity, which is completely different. And the other thing that gives it a chance to do is for some of those aromatic compounds to become free that weren't when you first smelled it. Retronasal aroma is the finish of a whiskey, and it can feel long, evolving, and layered. It can be very complex. So sometimes I get questions about why do certain whiskeys or aromas make me think of certain things, or why is it tied to my memory or my emotion? Because there are times when I've tasted whiskeys and enjoyed them immensely, and the next time it was like, oh, it's okay, but it's not as great as I thought it was. Or it's even better than I thought it was the first time. Well, the olfactory bulb, which processes these chemicals, it sits next to the brain's amygdala, which is responsible for emotion, and hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. So this is why whiskey can trigger nostalgia, comfort, deja vu, and emotional reactions. Aroma is the fastest route to memory recall, which is why tasters often say things like, this reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen, or this smells like fall, etc. The olfactory system detects complexity far better than the tongue. Again, I said you can only nose 5 taste 5 compounds or 5 experiences, whereas from a nasal perspective or olfactory perspective, you can identify hundreds of compounds in whiskey: esters, aldehydes, smoke, phenols, lactones, coconut, oak, vanilla. Your tongue can't do that. So the nose is the primary analytical tool used in whiskey tasting. But ethanol management matters. I talked about this issue around ethanol being an anesthetic. High-proof whiskey sends a lot of ethanol vapor upward. If you overwhelm the olfactory receptors, you temporarily dull them. This is why I'm not a big fan of high ethanol concentration products, single cask products that are, they market that they're 70 or 72% ABV. The problem with that is you get that alcohol blast, which can disable your ability to really sense the full profile within that whiskey. So That's why I like an ABV 45 to 55 at the most. I do have bottles that are up in the low 60s, but nothing above that. So this is why it's also important, as I mentioned, for gentle swirling, slow nosing, open mouth breathing. You know, you'll hear people go, which is basically pushing the aromas up the retronasal area. And use both nostrils, but you can use them separately. All of this helps you access more of the nuance of the whiskey. So the olfactory system creates the perception of finish as well. A long finish isn't just flavor lingering on your tongue, it's aroma molecules continuing to activate the retronasal pathways. This is why a whiskey can feel short, medium, long. It can feel evolving. It can feel layered. It can feel complex or simple, balanced or unbalanced. This is all part of this olfactory experience. So in short, your nose is doing the heavy lifting. The olfactory system is the reason whiskey tastes complex, emotional, and memorable. Without it, whiskey tastes like slightly sweet, slightly bitter alcohol and nothing more. So let's switch gears and go over to common Scotch versus common bourbon aromas. I mean, why are they different? Why do they smell different? And what should you expect from them? The first thing is, bourbons are driven by new charred oak and corn sweetness. Bourbon's aroma profile is heavily shaped by the fact that you're putting it into a brand new oak barrel. And the double oaked, and I've even seen a triple oaked whiskey now, that really delivers big, sweet, dessert-like notes. The most common bourbon aromas that you'll probably start experiencing or you'll experience in your early stages of olfactory development is vanilla, caramel, toffee, brown sugar, and it sort of goes down this list of honey, baking spices, toasted coconut, or oak lactones. The corn sweetness, a lot of people pick that up. A lot of people pick up the oak char or toasted wood, some nutty notes, peanut, and some pick up dark fruit, especially in older bourbons. So the age of the bourbon really plays a role in what you're going to pick up. But overall bourbon impressions are sweet, warm, dessert-leaning, oak-forward, and spice-enriched. Scotch, on the other hand, is driven by used barrels. And so most of the aromatic experience from Scotch comes from whatever was in the barrel before, not from the white oak charring, also from the malt, especially if it's a single malt, and then from regional styles, particularly if it's a Highland malt, a single malt whiskey, it might be very light and fruity, especially if it comes from Glenmorangie, because they use the tallest stills in the industry in Scotland. It could be peaty because it's an Islay Scotch. So all of those things play a role. But the used bourbon barrels or used sherry and wine barrels, that really has a huge influence on the character of the whiskey. So the most common Scotch aromas are malt, cereal grain, green apple, pear, citrusy, honey, heather. And the reason for the heather is because sometimes the peat that's used comes from grasses, light florals. They do pick up some vanillas from ex-bourbon casks, but much softer than a bourbon has. And then if it's a sherry cask, then you're going to start bringing in the raisins, the fig, the dry fruit kind of thing. You might pick up some oxidative notes like nutty notes. And again, the peat smoke from the Islay. Although it's sort of a misconception now because all the distilleries around Scotland are producing Scotch with a peat reek to it because it sells. So the overall Scotch impression is more of a grain-forward, fruit-driven, and regionally expressive with smoke and sherry influence depending on the style. The other thing is the coastal distilleries. Some people say they pick up this saltiness. I don't really pick that up. It's not something I've ever picked up. So one of the things that was frustrating to me when I first got involved with whiskey experiences is, can you improve the sense of smell? Can you improve your olfactory process? And the answer to that question is yes, absolutely. The sense of smell can improve with practice. and whiskey tasting is one of the best training grounds for it. The olfactory system is very adaptable, and it is actually the only one of our five senses that you can actually train. So you do have to train it. It's like a sport. It's like anything else. You have to practice. If you don't practice, it's not going to get any better. So why does this work well for whiskeys? First, the brain learns patterns. Your olfactory system isn't just your nose. It's your brain learning to recognize and categorize aroma molecules. Now, the issue is you have to practice, because if you're not doing it on a regular basis, you might pick it up. The first real aroma I ever picked up very clearly and tightly that was not like the vanilla, coconut, standard sort of bourbonish things was actually banana. And I picked it up off of a Woodford Reserve. So that's just my sensitivity, though. It's not the same for everybody. But the more you smell, the things that are easy to pick up that you'll be picking up early is vanillas, caramel, citrus. Smoke is very distinct. Grain. The faster your brain becomes exposed to these things, the faster you are able to identify and learn and then pick up new notes. But the other thing I really have done is I started changing my life so that I exposed myself to many different aromas, including like candles and different aftershave and things like that, because I would pick things that had different aromas, and it starts teaching my brain what those things smell like. The other thing that happens with the brain is that the repetition strengthens the neural pathways that are developing. Every time you nose a whiskey and name an aroma, so you have to pick up the verbiage, but once you do that, you're reinforcing that neural connection, and over time, those pathways become faster, more accurate, and more detailed. It's the same mechanism musicians use to develop ear training. Your vocabulary improves perception. You can only identify what you have language for. When you build an aroma vocabulary for things like apple, pear, leather, oak, honey, brine, it becomes part of your ability to identify those things by being able to describe them exactly what they are. I'll tell you, one of the products that I was just blown away by was one made by the old Raleigh distillery in Zebulon, North Carolina, and I'm going to do a review of that distillery and some of its products. But it was called Durrell Strawberry, and to this day, every time I crack open that bottle, I get this very strong Hubba Bubble bubblegum strawberry kind of aroma. So, again, it's that experience thing. It's experiencing different flights, doing comparative aromatic experiments. Those kinds of things really help you sharpen your ability to perceive and then to be able to communicate that. Focused smelling increases sensitivity. Intentional practice like nosing individual spices, I do that sometimes. I'll pick up cinnamon or cloves, and I like to drink certain drinks that are hot drinks. I love hot toddies, and I put cinnamon and cloves in that, and that repetition that I've developed has trained me to be able to pick up those things in the whiskey. This is why professional tasters often smell things like vanilla bean, cinnamon, citrus peels, toasted oak, malted barley. Those things all activate your receptors, and sometimes those receptors will actually multiply, which gives you an ability to perceive them at lower concentrations. So memory and smell are tightly linked. The olfactory bulb is wired directly to your memory center. The more aroma memories you build, the more vocabulary you build, the easier it becomes to recall and compare them during a tasting. And this is why seasoned tasters can say things like, this reminds me of a specific bakery from my childhood or something like childhood. So in short, yes, smell is trainable. With practice, you can become faster, more accurate, more sensitive, and whiskey becomes a richer and more layered experience. So what are the best ways to train your olfactory system? I get people that say that. I just don't pick these things up. How can I teach myself to do this better? The first thing is to smell with intention, not habit or not on occasion. Most people smell passively. They don't really practice at it. But when you do it, you should do it the exact same way every time. So it's an active, focused smelling, and you should be very thoughtful about writing down what you're smelling. So the first thing is to bring the glass to your nose slowly, as I mentioned. Start 6 to 7 inches away and bring it up so that you start picking up those congeners as they come off the surface of the liquid. Nose with your mouth slightly open. I know that sounds weird, and it can sound weird when people are watching you do it, but you have to do it. Use each nostril separately if possible. I find that very difficult to do. I guess you could try to cover one nostril, but I've usually got one that's not, that's plugged, so that's a challenge for me. So you have to work with your own physical capabilities as well. But you want to take short, gentle sniffs, not deep inhales, again, because you don't want that ethanol boom when you sniff, because that will overload your sensors and it will make it difficult to isolate individual notes. And then in this process, you want to build an aroma library or a vocabulary using the real ingredients. Your brain can only identify what it has smelled before. So you have to create a sensory pantry, if you will, and smell items regularly. So some of the items, especially bourbon heavy things, are like vanilla, bean, caramel, brown sugar, honey, toasted coconut. Those things are all things that you can find and practice with. Some of the fruit notes, green apple, pear, citrus, lemon peel, orange zest, dried fruits, especially from a sherry. You can smell raisins, figs, dates. Some of the spicy notes, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, black pepper, grains and malts. You can pick those up from malted barley, which you can buy on Amazon. All of these grains you can buy the raw grains, and you can actually buy them milled so that you can get small samples and smell them, or go to a distillery and ask if you can smell them. Cornmeal, rye bread, wheat flour, and then with oak, toasted oak chips, cedar, charred wood. And you can go to a Home Depot and smell wood. Peat and smoke, those things are pretty easy. You can actually order those online too, which I've done. You can smell campfire wood, seaweed, those kinds of things. So smelling these outside of whiskey builds the memory, the reference library you draw from during tastings. So that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to pick up these kinds of aromas and things in everyday activities. And again, I even picked up some candles and some aftershaves and things like that to try to expand my ability to smell these things and then to verbalize it. Another thing to do is practice comparative smelling, and I practice comparative tasting too. I find that is one of the best way to learn about these things. So you might you want to have things that contrast each other so that there's a definite difference that's easy to pick up when you first start. So 2 bourbons with different mash bills, maybe a rye, which is usually 95% rye, versus, say, corn whiskey, which is 80% corn in the mash bill. 2 scotches with different cask finishes, for instance, a bourbon or a sherry. 2 whiskeys at different proofs, maybe a 40, which is the lowest proof allowed for whiskey, and a 60. You'll be able to tell the difference between them. And then what you do, another thing is peated or unpeated scotch, but then what you do is that you get products that have reduced differences between those things. So maybe a 40 and a 45% ABV instead of a 40 and a 6%. Smell everything that you experience in your daily life. Your morning coffee, fresh fruit, baked goods, spices while cooking, wood, leather, soil, herbs. More aroma memories you build, the more you build, the more your whiskey vocabulary expands. Use your aroma kits. You can make your own. They're very expensive. I do find commercial kits helpful, but you can do it yourself too. You can buy vanilla extract or caramel syrup or maple syrup, citrus peels, toasted nuts, dried fruits. All of those kind of things you can experience on your own instead of paying $300, $400, $500 for a aroma kit. But the one thing to always do is to rotate them so that it reinforces recognition, but not only doing the same ones all the time, because then those are the only things you're going to be able to experience and to verbalize. Another thing to be very cognizant of is slowing down your nosing process. If you rush it, you miss things. So maybe when you first start, all you do is identify the category. This smells fruity, this smells spicy, this smells grainy, but you might not know that it's a malted grain or that it's cinnamon. It could be cloves. You don't know that to start potentially. And then narrow it down. For instance, if it was a fruit, does it smell more like apple? Is it more like a pear, citrusy, banana, strawberry? But make sure you also name every single time you pick something up, try to name it, whether it's just fruit or is it apple. Make sure that you develop that vocabulary associated with those aromas. So this trains your brain to analyze instead of just guess. Another thing you can do is get a journal. So have a journal of your aromas. Write down what you smelled, what it reminded you of, how confident you were, how the aroma changed over time. That's something that happens a lot. I was just tasting some port soy, which is a Glenglossa product, and it's peated. And usually for me, I struggle with peat because it overwhelms the other aromas in the whiskey. I find it to simplify the whiskey, so that's all I can smell. But the port soy, for whatever reason, the peating was low enough, and it actually changed over time. It reduced in the intensity, and then I was able to pick up some of the other aromas, and it really gave me a sense of the complexity of that product, of that whiskey, instead of having just that idea that it's just another heavily peated product. Another thing to do is revisit the same whiskey over multiple days. Your perception changes with your mood, the environment, food you've eaten, the time of day. Make sure your palate is clean. I use a tongue scraper as well as be careful about brushing your teeth, because if you have minty flavors and things like that, that's all going to affect your perception of the product. So in short, your olfactory system is absolutely trainable. The more you smell, compare, and name aromas, the sharper and more confident your whiskey sensory skills become. And it becomes a lot of fun, especially when you're with friends and other people, or if you're at a tour or something like that. So just to wrap this up into one line, nosing tells you what's coming, tasting tells you how it feels, the mouth feel. A few more answers to questions about water and whiskey, and then I'll wrap this up. Mouthfeel and weight. Water changes a whiskey's texture. A little can make it feel richer or silkier. Too much can thin it out. Always use clean, neutral water, distilled water. Flavor notes. Water can shift flavor perception, sometimes adding brightness, sometimes sweetness. Minerals in the water influence these changes as well. It also is used for proof adjustment. Distillers add water after maturation to reach the desired proof. You also have to add it after distillation sometimes, because, for instance, with bourbon, you can't put the whiskey into the cask until the ABV is 62.5 or lower. So you have to use distilled water to proof it down. So it affects the balance, the drinkability, the ABV, and ultimately the product's profile. Now, the other thing about it is when you're bottling it, if it comes out of the cask at an ABV of 55 and you typically bottle it at 45, you have to use water for that. And that's a lot different than production water. Production water is just used for cooling, that kind of thing. It doesn't really affect the profile of the product. Local water does matter. Local water sources shape a whiskey's character. The limestone-rich water from Kentucky gives bourbon its signature softness and slight tartness. But many craft distilleries know what the mineral concentration is, and they try to recreate that. And so they add minerals to mimic the profile. Pure spring or glacier water is prized for its cleanliness. And a lot of the distilleries in Scotland have spring water that they use, and they've been using it for centuries and aren't willing to change. What about adding water and ice to whiskey for tasting? Can adding water or ice affect the flavor? Small amounts of water can open up aromas and soften alcohol intensity. Ice chills and dilutes the whiskey, and both change the texture and flavor release. But there are arguments for drinking whiskey neat. Neat preserves whiskey exactly as it was bottled. Full strength, full aroma, no dilution. This is preferred when evaluating high-end or complex whiskey. Some people have naturally heightened smell sensitivity, but anyone can improve their sensory skills with practice, as I mentioned. Now, I typically drink my whiskey neat. If it is very high in alcohol, I will add some water to it because I don't want that burn to overwhelm my experience with the whiskey. What about ice? What about the advantages or disadvantages of adding ice? Ice cools the whiskey, it reduces alcohol burn, and making high-proof spirits more approachable. The other side of that is it deadens some of these highly aromatic compounds, so it can reduce the overall experience of the congeners in that product. So if you're going to use ice, the best thing to do is to use like one of those big blocks. And the reason for doing that is because it will melt slower and it will have less rapid effect on the aromatic compounds. So that's pretty much it as far as that go. So neat is full flavor and aroma, best for evaluating complexity. With water, it opens up some subtle notes. It softens the alcohol intensity or burn. Great for beginners or high-proof pours. And ice can make it refreshing and cooling. Gradual dilution mellows the whiskey versus if you put like a ground up ice in it, it will just dilute it too rapidly. The amount of water or ice that you add is completely up to you. I mean, if you like more water and you find that that's the best way to drink it for you, then do what you enjoy. I don't try to tell anybody how to enjoy their spirits. When I was at the Glenlivet distillery in Scotland, the master blender who had been in the whiskey industry for well over 50 years, he recommended adding water up to about 20% of the whiskey's volume. When he evaluated cask, that's what he did. But all I can say is use clean, neutral water and high quality ice. Don't add something to your whiskey that's going to change the profile. And the only last thing I'll say is experts are helpful, but their preferences aren't yours. Use them as guides, not rules. If you find someone whose palate matches yours, great. But never stop exploring, never stop tasting, never stop smelling, because that's how you really develop your own ability to figure out which bottles you enjoy, which whiskeys you want to buy. So as promised, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the Man Cave Distillery in Weston, West Virginia. My daughter was married in October of 2025, and on my way down, I stopped and stayed overnight with my two boys, Jax and Rip, the border collies, and we visited the Man Cave Distillery in Weston, West Virginia. This is my second trip to the distillery, and just to discover more about the distillery and their production, because it's very unique in that they do produce bourbon, but they produce it with 100% corn. I think I've mentioned this product before, and it's actually a very good product. Now, Eric, the master distiller, welcomed the conversation and shared insights into their unique production methods. Because they only use corn across their entire product line, they've developed a specialized approach, which is to grind the corn into ultra-fine granules to maximize starch exposure and fermentable sugar production. The result is a spirit that's both technically impressive and is very flavorful. It's deeply flavorful. They also use local spring water sourced from a nearby mine, and it has a pH of about 6.8, and the water is exceptionally pure. That combined with a week-long fermentation process. Think about it. Corn is very hard to break down. Now you can add exogenous enzymes, which they do, and this fermentation process is likely to contribute to an interesting mix of fruitiness and floral aromas, which I consistently pick up when I taste this product. I have a couple bottles of it at home. My favorite from the lineup is their Cask Strength Distiller's Reserve. It's a 4-year-old 99 proof straight bourbon whiskey made from 100% corn. While it doesn't carry the bottled in bond designation due to its 49.5 instead of 50% ABV, which is just a half a point shy of the requirement, it still delivers a rich and satisfying experience. Eric didn't mention why they chose that proof, but it works beautifully with the product and it's very enjoyable. Man Cave's a rugged, off-the-beaten-path distillery that blends Appalachian grit with intentional and international acclaim. You can learn more at their website at mancave.com. So just to sum up this podcast, yeast plays a crucial role in whiskey production. There are over 1,500 different yeast strains that bourbon distillers can use, and each type offers distinct benefits, such as tolerating higher temperatures. It can speed up fermentation. Some produce more alcohol, get better yield. Yeast contribute to the signature aroma of the finished bourbon as well. While subsequent processes like distillation and aging also matter, many flavors in the spirit can only be created during fermentation. So distillers carefully choose the yeast strains and the combination of yeasts to develop the profiles, the aroma profiles and flavor profiles to shape the taste of their whiskey. So thanks for joining me on this whiskey deep dive. Join me at the Buffalo Distilling Company for a deluxe tour and tasting, or sign up for a whiskey workshop, and you will be able to learn more grain to glass about whiskey. Again, please leave questions or comments on my website at bisonbourbonspiritstc.com. This podcast provides general information and entertainment. Always drink responsibly and consult local regulations before imbibing. This podcast is meant for listeners who are legal drinking age only. So whether as a beginner discovering new flavors or an aficionado pursuing perfection, the journey has always another fascinating glass to offer. I'll be back next time with another spiritual event. Until then, check out the blog, explore my merchandise, and join me for a workshop or tasting. Keep sipping, keep exploring, and remember, good whiskey is like a well-crafted story. Do you love bourbon and BS? Then tell a friend. We're trying to grow this thing the old-fashioned way, one honest pour and one honest listener at a time. Cheers to bold spirits and curious minds.